World leaders have condemned violent scenes in Washington after supporters of U.S. President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building on Wednesday. The riots forced the suspension of a joint session of Congress to certify Joe Biden's electoral victory. This happened after a historic win for Democrats in the Georgia Senate runoff. Joining us tonight is Professor John Stremlau, who is an international relations expert. Professor Stremlau, good evening, and thank you so much for your time. I just want to know perhaps your own impressions last night, at least South African time, watching the scenes that were unfolding on Capitol Hill, and what it felt like for you as an expat watching what's happening back home.
Well, it was terribly shocking, of course, because this was wanton militia activity. And when I think of the police force and the suppression of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was peaceful back in July, to see these renegade white supremacists overrunning the Capitol building was beyond shock. And I don't begrudge any foreign leader from drawing attention to it, particularly Democratic leaders. I don't think Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned it, but he probably should. On the other hand, I hope that he and Joe Biden have a much more productive relationship than with the Trumpster.
Have we seen scenes like that before in democratic America, where the Capitol has come under attack in that way?
The last time was in 1814, I think, in the War of 1812 with Great Britain. Great Britain burned down the Capitol. It got as far as Washington, but the U.S. nevertheless repulsed the British, and I hope that they repulse this mad crowd of crazy thugs who really did raise havoc with the process last night, which should have been a formality. It went on for 15 hours. It didn't end until 3:28 in the morning.
And of course, some of the events that were happening yesterday overshadowing that voting process, even though they were unfolding at the same time. And we also had the results coming out of Georgia, where I believe another record there or a stronghold has somewhat been broken when it comes to the Democrats being able to secure power.
Well, the irony for me is that I had to watch that violence last night when I was so happy, because I still vote that was my last residence in the United States, was Fulton County, Georgia, John Lewis's old district, and for the Carter's, I lived working at the Carter Center, and so we did vote in both the national election on November 3rd, and then for the runoff. And I was, of course, thrilled. There's never been a black senator from Georgia, and I remember when Georgia voted for George Wallace, it was a racist, segregated country, like apartheid country state, and now it's very progressive in the sense that at least they elected a young Jewish filmmaker, John Ossoff, and one of Martin Luther King's proteges, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, who's runs the Ebenezer Baptist Church, King's old church. It's really a wonderful, wonderful development, and a sign that America is becoming more diverse and pluralistic.
Of course, it also comes at a time where many believe that some of the scenes that unfolded at Capitol Hill are a confirmation of America being inherently racist. So what role then does a vote like what we saw in Georgia play, I suppose, in challenging that kind of narrative that has evolved around the U.S. over the last year or so, as the formation of right-wing groups seems to be growing by the day?
Well, that's a very profound and important question, because South Africa came to terms with its white supremacists and its history and there was violence in the 1990s, as we all know, but nevertheless cut a deal for a new constitution, which is much more modern. The United States has been scarred from the birth defect, from its birth in the 1780s, with slavery being enshrined in the first draft of the first Constitution, and yet being committed to the declaration that all people are created equal, or all men are created equal back in those days. So the Constitution reflects the states' rights bargain and with the slave states, but also the politics continue to have the sediments of slavery running through deep in those blood veins. And I do think we're exercising it. I think Obama's election was one sign of that. And Joe Biden's election, which is heavily dependent on African American votes, the African American community saved Joe Biden's candidacy and his electoral majority, and now the Senate majority. So if he is responsive to their interests in having better cooperation with Africa, that will be good for Africa, good for America, and the country will become a more diverse and unified country under the Democrats. But the Republicans still have a strong base in rural America, white supremacist America, and that's going to take time to work through, just like here.
Yeah. You know, when you raise the issue of the Republicans, of course, you also bring up the conversation that I think many Americans have been having, which is around those Republican representatives who voted yesterday against confirming the vote and what that actually said about the state of democracy in the United States. Are you worried about that?
Well, you're always worried, but it says more about the state of the Republican Party, which should implode and reconstitute. There's a tradition, it's a two-party system. It's different than what we have here in a more proportional representation. But the ANC has deep cleavages. I'm a member, and I know these cleavages are run very, very deep, but they're very different than what we see in the U.S. because of the way in which the state-based constitution privileges and gives overweight to what are now predominantly Republican Midwest rural states, and that's got to be worked through some institutional reforms. Whether or not in a badly divided and polarized country you can get those reforms, probably not right away. But if Joe Biden is able to conquer COVID and show that the Americans will be responsible international players with things like vaccine use and distribution internationally, then I think there'll be some momentum, because the country is also for climate change mitigation, and there will be that new investment in infrastructure that will have international implications for trade with Africa, as well as dealing with the climate problem out here in Africa. So I'm hopeful, but it's going to be a slog, because democracy is never easy. It's always hard work, and it's always fragile.
Professor Stremlau, as we're speaking, I'm watching live pictures on our screen that are streaming out of Capitol Hill tonight. And there seems to have been a big emphasis today on reinforcing the security around Capitol Hill and putting up all sorts of barricades that will prevent what we saw happen yesterday, I suppose, from repeating itself. And it brings us to the issue of accountability. Has there been enough accountability when it comes to why yesterday's scenes were even allowed to unfold in the first place?
The short answer is no, of course. On the one hand, you have the accountability of those who perpetrated the violence. I do think that they will be held accountable finally, but there's a long tradition of holding civil rights demonstrators and the Black Lives Matter, for example. Look at the police force that was out that Donald Trump arranged with the Pentagon back in July. And then there's Donald Trump's accountability. And that's a more complicated issue, but no man is above the law, as Nelson Mandela famously told us, and that's true of any credible democracy. So one of the questions that'll have to be raised after he's out of office on January 20th, because I don't think in the next 2 weeks they will get accountability, but is will he be exposed? And that's a big subject, but we may talk about that again in the future, perhaps.
America has long defined itself and has been seen, I suppose, by some outside of its borders as being a beacon of democracy. Do you think that still remains intact in the way that it was perhaps before a Donald Trump presidency?
Well, it will if it comes to terms with the state capture threat of the minority Republicans who are leveraging their smaller but greater disproportionate power in the Senate. But Oliver Tambo, I heard speak in New York in the 1980s, when he just read the Declaration of Independence and said, how can you Americans square this value of all people are created equal with your support for the apartheid regime here in South Africa? So South Africans are very much aware of the long history and the struggle for racial justice in America. And I think that a conversation between how South Africans are dealing with political reform and the consolidation of democracy here, and how they're going to have to reform and consolidate democracy in the United States would be very fruitful. So that's my hopeful note that I want to at least register.
All right, Professor John Stremlau, let me thank you so much for your time.